last lecture, we discussed the Buddha and talked about how he was trying to emphasize practice much more than he was any theoretical discussion about suffering. He was concerned with how to go about solving it in the world. Nevertheless, in order to teach others, it was important for him to convey this message in certain ways. And it wasn't too long before certain basic doctrines of Buddhism got formulated. Indeed, all of these tracing to certain things that the Buddha said in his sermons. One of these basic doctrines is the doctrine of anatman, no self. Now, you might notice that anatman uses the word atman, a word that we've known from Brahmanism. When the Buddhists say that they believe in the doctrine of anatman, what they're denying is the idea of a separate individual self. But nevertheless, the word looks like no atman, and a Brahmanist might say, well, this is really a misunderstanding of the way we use that word. I mean, after all, when we say that everyone is atman, we're not saying that there is a substantial self that's individual. We're saying that there's one single self in all individuals. So the point is really not to emphasize individuality. Nevertheless, the Buddhist way of looking at the Brahmanic view does tend to see what they say as focusing on the individual self. Maybe the same self ultimately, but too much focus from their point of view on what's individuated. In addition to this idea that there's no self, along with it is the idea that there aren't any intrinsic entities, individual entities of any sort. So it's not just people. There's no self of an animal. There is no thing that continues in the same form over time. Everything is moving and changing. Of course, we tend to look at these things in the world and see them as relatively stable, but that's a matter of our thinking. We've abstracted from our experience. We've focused on certain processes that are moving rather slowly, and we tend to reify those things into specific things. But strictly speaking, the things are not permanent any more than we are. In addition to this doctrine of what there isn't, namely things, is the more positive view, a view called interdependent arising. The Sanskrit word is pratitya samutpada, but I think we'll just call it interdependent arising. The idea here is that everything is linked to everything else, an idea that we've already discussed somewhat. But in particular, the notion of interdependent arising, I mean, what does it mean, interdependent? That everything that we tend to focus on as a thing is really only relative to other things. It comes about only in the context of the whole coming about. That you can't really have even a clear conception of a thing independent of all other things. So although we can talk in terms of tables and chairs and act as though those are things that have some permanence, strictly speaking, they're only a certain thing that we can focus on, or a certain way of focusing on a part of what's really an interdependent whole. I'm going to read a picture of a vision, or a description of a picture of this vision from Francis Cook, who's interpreting Buddhism in connection with a particular school that developed in China, Mahayana Buddhism. And in this particular description, the Indian god, the Brahmanic god Indra, is mentioned. Basically, the idea of interdependent arising is being understood in a kind of image that comes from this more traditional Brahmanic account. Far away in the heavenly abode of the great god Indra, there is a wonderful net which has been hung by some cunning artificer in such a manner that it stretches out infinitely in all directions. In accordance with the extravagant tastes of the deities, the artificer has hung a single glittering jewel in each eye of the net. And since the net itself is infinite in dimension, the jewels are infinite in number. There hang the jewels glittering like stars of the first magnitude, a wonderful sight to behold. If we now arbitrarily select one of these jewels for inspection and look closely at it, we will discover that in its polished surface there are reflected all the other jewels in the net, infinite in number. Not only that, but each of the jewels reflected in this one jewel is also reflecting all the other jewels, so that there is an infinite reflecting process occurring. So you get the picture of each of these jewels reflecting all other jewels, that its very essence involves everything else. And the picture of the net suggests the way that everything is all part of the same thing. Now, these are figurative images, of course, but this idea of everything hanging together and the contents of every particular thing being really everything else that's around it are very much part of this notion of interdependent arising. So when we think falsely that we're an individuated self, we're ignoring the truth of interdependent arising. To bring this a little bit more into focus, we might consider, well, where exactly do we consider the boundaries of ourselves to be? We might think, well, the boundaries of our bodies. I mean, that's kind of an everyday use of the term. If I want to point to myself, it's my body I point to. But you can say, well, there's a sense in which that's true, but if you start thinking about it, where did your body come from? Well, you think back to your parents. You might think of your whole family tree as really being connected with yourself. I mean, the self that you're focusing on wouldn't be here without them. You might also think about the fact that you need nutrition. It's not as if the boundaries of yourself are that stable. You have to eat. Things come in from the outside. Okay, again, it's not exactly like the environment and the self are completely stable. Or you might think of your social world. If someone comes up to me and insults me or says something that I really take offense at, that's going to affect me. Obviously, what's going on inside seems to be connected with what's going on outside me. The boundaries are fairly porous. Or suppose someone pays me a compliment. Well, then I feel great. Again, what's going on inside me has been directly affected by what I think of as outside myself. And so even a basic notion of who myself is starts to get to seem a little bit nebulous as I think further about, well, what is this self? I can't exist without air, without the earth underneath me. Should I consider those part of myself as well? Well, the Buddhist picture of interdependent arising asserts, yes, you should. Because in fact, it's only a kind of product of thinking that makes us even suspect that there's something that's really separate and detached from the rest of existence. But if we really start thinking it through, we recognize that everything about us is something that is flowing through us in effect. And that's what the idea of interdependent arising is all about. Our language doesn't reflect interdependent arising, precisely because language tries to pick things out of the flow. And that's reasonable. I mean, there are a lot of practical reasons to focus on this or that in its current configuration. But unfortunately, we tend to take the words too seriously, or the fact that the words sound the same over and over again too seriously. So even though I say chair, some molecules of the chair probably have changed from earlier today. The fact that someone moves the chair changes its configuration in the rest of the environment, and so on. Even though it's relatively stable, it's stable compared to lots of other things, compared to the airflow in the room, say, it's nevertheless not really completely separate and enduring itself. And this notion of the lack of endurance leads to another notion that is pretty basic in Buddhist doctrine, anicca, or the notion of impermanence. This is the basic doctrine that everything passes away. Nothing stays the same. We've emphasized how we ourselves don't stay the same. We can't make ourselves secure. We're going to die eventually, for example. But absolutely everything is flowing in the same kind of way. Now, this is very interesting because at the same time, the Buddhists accept the notion of karma. You may have noticed already that these terms are in fact Sanskrit terms. Siddhartha Gautama was Indian, so this is the language that he's using. And in some cases, the way the terms are used in Buddhism and Brahmanism are similar, but not always entirely understood the same way. And this is true of karma, although they are fairly similar. What's strange is the idea that karma suggests that certain things continue, certain processes that get started continue into further lives. But you might ask, well, if everything changes continually, if there is no stable self, what is reborn? It's a very good question, and a lot of Buddhist scholars have thought a lot about this. Basically, they would say, well, again, the idea of processes is what karma has to do with, and that's precisely what the Buddha argues that we are. We are a set of processes. And some of these processes continue into further life beyond our own death. You might think of this as a little bit like a wave. The particular drops of water that are in a wave change somewhat as the wave goes forward. So a wave might start some distance out away from the shore, and some of the drops are going to end up, in a sense, getting off the flow of the wave. But nevertheless, there's a kind of continuity. The wave goes forward. And you might say, well, in the conception of karma and rebirth that Buddhists accept, you've got something like this notion of the wave. There's some things that do continue, but it's not a stable self. It's not a stable self that's in a body, gets removed from the body, and appears in another body. But that whole picture is mistaken to begin with, according to the Buddhists. There's no stable self moving from life to life, but there's no stable self moving from moment to moment. You've got exactly the same kind of conceptual problem you do just thinking about how you move from what you were a minute ago to what you are now. Certain processes have been going on. And the idea of karma is just that some of these processes are observably continued beyond your own individual life. Nirvana is a notion that we talked about a little bit in the last lecture, the idea of ceasing craving. And this whole notion of rebirth and the continuation of these processes is linked up with nirvana in that the processes that continue forward, that move forward from certain attempts you've made in your experience, goals that you've had that you've attempted to pursue, if you stop craving in that way, then these processes that go forward because of that craving come to an end. So nirvana has to do with the whole idea of these processes that move from life to life, this kind of dynamisms that have a momentum of their own because of you're putting so much effort into some project or other. If you've stopped craving, then those sorts of things come to an end too. And that is, in effect, the goal. Samsara is a term that's used in much Buddhist thought. And it essentially just means that there is a chain of causation through experience, and that this experience continues beyond an individual life. So samsara basically means things follow. I mean, one thing causes another. If I put a lot of effort into amassing wealth for myself, that's going to continue to have an impact beyond my death. Might have an impact in the lives of my children. They might end up feeling that that's a good project too and continue with that. Or they might inherit a lot of wealth and have that as certainly something they have to decide what to do with. In other words, it's not something that's attached to my personality in the way that we often think of our personality. But certainly the whole project is something that lingers and has an impact on the environment beyond even the point where I myself am around. And samsara is the whole world that we see where one thing causes another, where we can see processes appearing. And different schools of Buddhism have developed different ways of looking at samsara, as we'll go on to talk about. Now, as soon as you have doctrines, you have the possibility of people interpreting the doctrines rather differently. And eventually this came about in Buddhism too. No matter how practically oriented the point of all these doctrines was, exactly how to take them and how to think about them and how to apply them became real issues. Now, first of all, when the Buddha was preaching, his followers were a rather elitist group in a couple of senses. One was that his followers were originally pretty much upper-class people. You didn't have a lot of people from the lower caste in the audiences of his sermons. However, he did not accept the caste system, so that was one sense in which he was quite revolutionary. If you think of yourself as being a member of a caste, it's rather easy to think of yourself as having to do with other members of your caste or having certain very formal relationships with members of other castes. I mean, you employ people who are in certain walks of life to do certain kinds of work for you, say, or you interact with them in the community as a whole, but not very interpersonally. I mean, there's a certain kind of distance that's built into the case structure. And the Buddha thought that was really falsifying of all of human experience. It gives some kind of justification for viewing other people as not being that connected to you. And in fact, what his whole vision was that we're all interconnected. We're interconnected with other people, with animals, really with all beings. So any structure like that, that's a social structure that discourages that vision, isn't really very desirable. But nevertheless, I mean, being a prince, the people that he knew were often people that were also in similar walks of life or similar backgrounds to himself. So there was a kind of elitism that just came about because the people he was talking to were the people that he knew, I mean, the people that he encountered. On the other hand, there was a kind of elitism too in early Buddhism because the focus became founding monasteries and nunneries and joining these communities as a way of practicing Buddhism. It seemed like a pretty radical vision that the Buddha was proposing. And with all of these doctrines assembled in your mind and trying to figure out how these all work and how to connect these insights with your own personal psychology seemed like a real challenge. And so the idea that becoming a religious, joining the religious life and learning how to incorporate these in your life seemed like a kind of natural approach. And this has remained the emphasis of Theravada Buddhism, the form of Buddhism that predominates in South Asia. One interesting fact about Buddhism and the way it moved through the world is, although it began in the Indian subcontinent, that actually isn't where it became perhaps most influential. After all, Buddhism is not the major religion of India. Brahmanism remains one major religion, Islam remains another. Buddhism certainly has many adherents, but it hasn't really swept the subcontinent. But nevertheless, Buddhism did sweep through Asia, as we'll be discussing. In various ways, Buddhism and the cultures that it encountered developed certain forms or certain, at least, external shapes. The form of Buddhism that continues primarily to be practiced in the Indian subcontinent and other southern nations in Asia is this form that I'm discussing, Theravada Buddhism, which emphasizes the monastic life. But around the period somewhere between 200 BCE to 100 CE, there came a divergence between those who thought that this was still the way to interpret Buddha's teaching, that the monastic life was the way to approach it, or the nunnery was the way to approach it, and those who began to think rather differently about it. This new school, and this is one basic division in Buddhism, a kind of single divergence, you might say. This new school has been called Mahayana Buddhism, emphasizing the idea of a big vehicle, that Buddhism is not something just for those who enter the convent or the monastery, but it's something of widespread application. And that distinction between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism continues to this day. Mahayana Buddhism is the form that is predominant in Eastern Asia, nations like China, Japan, Korea, to the extent that that's a major presence there. So what we need to understand at this point is what exactly went with this division. Well, first of all, Theravada Buddhism traced more directly, historically, to the historical Buddha. It was the first form of Buddhism to develop. And its emphasis is very much on the idea that the historical Buddha was the savior of humanity. So this is a little bit like the coming of Christ in the Christian tradition. There was an enlightened being that appeared on earth and showed us the way to go. The approach that the Theravadan tradition takes to what we ought to be doing as a result of this vision that's come to earth is trying to become worthy of nirvana. Now here, the blissful experience of nirvana is what's being emphasized. So the aim is to become an arhat, someone who has really succeeded in taking the whole vision on board, on really fulfilling the Eightfold Path of the Four Noble Truths. And if you really succeed in that, then you've made yourself, in a sense, deserving of this blissful experience. Meditation in particular is stressed by the Theravada school. So trying to come to insight by means of meditation is a major emphasis. And reasonably enough, this is something that you can devote quite a bit of time to if you're in a monastery or a nunnery. So the idea of the religious life being the precondition for all this meditation that's involved in gaining insight seems to be, in a sense, a package. So basically, the idea is to really succeed in the fundamental spiritual goal for Buddhism, you need to join the religious life. I mean, there may be some exceptions, but on the whole, that's the method for doing it. Mahayana Buddhism, on the other hand, tends to take different views of all of these things. For example, even the nature of the historical Buddha. Certainly, Mahayana Buddhism views the Buddha as a marvelous enlightened being. And his example historically is what tends to be stressed. But here the example is his example of being a compassionate person. If the Buddha really had this vision and fulfilled it, and we can learn certain things about his life, this gives us some impression of what it's really like to be someone completely captivated with the full vision of the interdependence of everything and the compassion that comes from that. Nevertheless, the idea of the Buddha is something that Mahayana thought sees all around us. The claim is that the Buddha nature is in everything. And what do they mean by the Buddha nature? Well, if you think about the interdependent connection of everything as being the truth, the Buddha nature, in a sense, is this whole interconnected thing. It's undifferentiated. We've got a little bit the same problem that we do in talking about the characteristics of Brahman. Because it's the whole, we're not going to be able to make a lot of fine-tuned points or distinctions about it. Distinctions have to do with apparent things within the whole. But nevertheless, there is this fundamental nature to which we're all connected. And it's often viewed by the Mahayana Buddhists as something very bright, beautiful. The image of gems in a net is a very good Mahayana image in this respect. You might say the Buddha nature is like the net, where all these gems are magnifying all the other gems. It's an absolutely beautiful vision. So we can't say much about it, but we nevertheless have the sense of this being bright, entirely lovely. And this notion of this being what all things ultimately are, a kind of substratum, if you will, of all things, what supports all of these processes that we observe and tend to take too seriously. This is the Buddha nature, and it's absolutely everywhere. Another way of talking about the Buddha nature is a term that is very important in Mahayana thought, sunyata, which strictly speaking means emptiness. What's empty is the idea that there really is anything in front of us. We imagine that we see things, we imagine ourselves to be selves, but as soon as we start thinking about that, it's as if this is a mirage that disappears. It's empty. We can't get a grip on any of these things that we think are around us because, in fact, these are something like mirages. So it's emptiness, ultimately. There's just one thing, this one fundamental substratum, and everything that appears on top of it is not really there. Its only reality is this fundamental unity. This fundamental unity is also timeless. So we can see it in all kinds of different circumstances if we're able to penetrate appearances. But one other feature of the timelessness of the Buddha nature is that for the Mahayana school, there have been many Buddhas through history, and there'll be Buddhas again. After all, a Buddha is an enlightened being. And certainly Siddhartha Gautama was an enlightened being. But he's not the only being ever to be enlightened. And so the idea that there may be Buddhas living here and now is not foreign to Mahayana thought. The expectation that there will be Buddhas arriving again is something that is taken very seriously. The idea is that there are some people who've actually succeeded in making this vision completely their own and making that the entire way of life that they have. And so instead of focusing too much attention on this moment when Siddhartha Gautama appeared, Siddhartha Gautama is viewed as this wondrous example that we know a fair amount about, but his vision is something that has been true forever and will continue to reappear on earth and be articulated by new and other Buddhas. And certainly the notion of the laity is rather different in the Mahayana conception. The laity are perfectly able to become enlightened, just as people who are monks and nuns. Part of the idea here is that it isn't so much that meditating all the time is necessary to being a good Buddhist. That may help, but there are many walks of life in which one can be a perfectly enlightened being. I mean, that would be the aim at any rate. And good deeds contribute to one's ability to be enlightened. A little bit from the Mahayana point of view, Theravada focuses too much on the vision and not so much on maybe other aspects of the Eightfold Path. But doing things that express compassion helps change your own orientation toward the world. You start recognizing your connection with other beings when you treat them compassionately. So good deeds are part of the process too. And this suggests that, in general, an active stance in the world among other people is something that's highly desirable from a Buddhist point of view. Instead of aiming to become an arhat, someone worthy of the blissful experience of nirvana, which really removes you from kind of the everyday picture of reality that we all start with, the aim for the Mahayana school is to become a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is someone who does fully incorporate the Buddhist vision, fully see reality as it is, as all interconnected. But instead of simply becoming absorbed in the bliss of this insight, the bodhisattva makes a vow to do whatever is possible to redeem the rest of the world. Instead of just being satisfied with bliss and an experience of bliss, the bodhisattva engages with others in order to treat them with compassion and help make compassion more the vision that everyone has. So it's a little bit more oriented toward the external world. Some people describe this as the bodhisattva being on the brink between samsara, the world of cause and effect that we see, and nirvana, a way of looking at the world that sees beyond that. And in a sense, in order to help others to become enlightened, it is necessary to maintain touch with the idea that, yes, in our ordinary way of looking at things, we do see individuals as separate. We do see things as continuous. We don't tend to see processes. So part of compassion is to maintain an awareness of how people that haven't yet been enlightened are looking at things. And the bodhisattva aims to be a kind of bridge between that original everyday view and the enlightened view of the Buddha. How does one become a bodhisattva? Well, anyone trying to be a bodhisattva, like everyone else, starts out not there, not yet able to look at the world as all interconnected. But you become a bodhisattva by acting like one. You act as though you already have attained this vision. It might be that as an aspiring bodhisattva, sometimes you really don't feel terribly compassionate, but nevertheless you act as though you do. You act in such a way that compassion is the character of your action. And that brings you into a role that allows you increasingly to see the world in the right way. Pure compassion involves this correct way of seeing. And what you're doing when you really have compassion is perceiving this same fundamental Buddha nature in everything and every being you interact with. A bodhisattva, one who actually has achieved the state of bodhisattva, in a way might appear a lot like everybody else, since the bodhisattva is not blissfully just experiencing the reality of the vision, but is engaged with people in everyday life. But nevertheless, there are 6 marks of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is particularly charitable, boundless in giving. A bodhisattva's conduct, morally speaking, is impeccable. A bodhisattva has forbearance. A bodhisattva, in that sense, is patient. The fact is that everybody doesn't share this vision, but the bodhisattva just continues to interact in the effort to bring about this widespread vision. A bodhisattva is radiant. Someone who's really attained the status of bodhisattva has a kind of beauty or energy that's just expressed within them. A bodhisattva also meditates, and ultimately a bodhisattva is filled with wisdom. And this is the wisdom that comes about just because the bodhisattva actually does have the experience of emptiness or the Buddha nature everywhere. What the bodhisattva has realized is there is no self-existence. And so even already achieving nirvana, which I think from a selfish point of view sounds kind of good, like bliss, that would be great. But the bodhisattva no longer has that vision, because the bodhisattva has come to recognize that the idea of self-existence is just false. So their vision is completely engaged in understanding how we're all interconnected. That vision makes them beautiful, and it also makes them wise.